Good morning, Crimestituents! I say good morning because I publish at 5 a.m. on Fridays, and I just know that every single one of you set your alarms and wake up bright and early on a Friday morning to be the first person to hear the latest session of Crime in Congress, and I thank you for it. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. You are the first person to listen to this session. Congratulations. Now, it is a cozy session of Crime in Congress today because I am recording this at 9:20 p.m. on Thursday, and this comes out in just a few short hours, which I've never done before, and I'm not entirely sure is a good thing, but I am excited that there will be no delay between me recording this and you getting to hear it. This is a session that I'm very excited about. It's been on my list since the beginning, and it's one of the most infamous cases of all time. So let's get into it. Hi, I'm Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. Okay, let's talk about the woman who may have helped kill a president. Mary Surratt. You might have heard that name in history class and promptly forgot it. I know I did. But buckle up, because this is not your average Civil War story. This is about lies, betrayal, obsession, and a woman who may have been in the wrong place at the worst possible time, or perhaps exactly where she wanted to be. Before we jump in, I want to give credit where credit is due. For this episode, I read a book by author Sarah Miller. I won't say the name of the book just yet because it sort of spoils the whole thing, but it's a wonderful book that I highly recommend reading, and I will mention it at the end and cite it below. Now, let's dive in. Mary Elizabeth Jenkins was born in 1823 in southern Maryland to tobacco farmers who enslaved 11 black people. A brutal but unfortunately common fact of life in that region and area. She was the middle child, sandwiched between two brothers, John Zadok and James Archibald Jenkins. Mary's life started unraveling rather early. In 1825, when she was just 2 years old, her father died. Suddenly, her mother was left alone with 3 children under 5 years old and no partner at all to help her. And here's the crazy part. She didn't remarry. That might not sound shocking by today's standards, but in the 1820s, that was nearly unheard of. Widowed women didn't just go it alone. But Mary's mom, she kept the farm running herself, with, major asterisk here, the help of free labor from those she enslaved. And this is where Mary's life starts to look different than those around her. Despite growing up during a time when women weren't really expected, or in many cases even allowed, to do much outside of the home, Mary got something most girls didn't: an education. In 1835, when she was 12, Mary enrolled at the Academy for Young Ladies in Alexandria, Virginia, a Catholic boarding school not so far from where I am recording right now. Tuition, room, and board cost just $25 for 3 months. That's about $750 in today's money. Can you imagine? Just imagine for a minute being able to live off $750 for 3 months. That's like my grocery budget for a single month, and I don't even have kids to feed. Inflation really is just insane, and so is cost of living, especially in Northern Virginia. While at school, she wasn't just learning manners and embroidery. This place gave Mary structure, identity, and religion. She converted to Catholicism there, took the confirmation name Eugenia, and she would be devout for the rest of her life, which makes everything that happens later a lot more complicated. Now, let's talk about the first man who changed her life, other than her father in his tragic passing. At age 16, Mary met John Surratt. He was 26. Yeah, gross. But again, different era. John was, let's be nice and say, a walking red flag. He had no known birth parents and was raised by foster parents on a Washington, D.C. farm, which is not his fault and is not one of his red flags, but trust me, they're coming. He also had no siblings, which was a very, very scandalous backstory for the time. And before he even met Mary, he got another woman, Caroline Sanderson, pregnant, and had to be court-ordered to pay child support in 1840. If you have to be court-ordered to be a parent, then something is really wrong with you. So, of course, they got married. What drew Mary to this man, we may never know. I certainly couldn't figure it out. But maybe it was just the fact that Mary was 17. And, they got married in August, and John, with all his baggage and questionable judgment, became her husband. They settled on land John had inherited from his foster family, where they ran a grist mill, which I had to look up, but they were basically grinding flour and cornmeal. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't a cash cow for them. They racked up a ton of debt and eventually had to sell the mill. At one point, they even moved in with John's mom, but then she died and the house burned down. I read that their theory was that one of the women or maybe not women, but one of the people that they enslaved burned the house down, but that was not confirmed. It was like the Surratts were cursed. But then, for a while, things started to look up. In 1852, they bought 187 acres of land in Prince George's County at the crossroads of Marlborough, Piscataway, and New Cut Road. They built a 9-room tavern they called Surratt's Villa. It was meant for travelers, and it took off. They got a post office installed, a polling location. The whole area literally changed its name to Surrattsville. That's how influential their tavern became. Today, this is known as Clinton, Maryland. They were successful enough that they bought a second property, a 3-story townhouse in Washington, D.C. on H Street. They rented it out. That house, by the way, still exists today. It's a restaurant called Walk and Roll, and I'm actually going there on Saturday because I am just so excited to see this house for reasons that we will get to here shortly. The street has since been renumbered, so it's actually at 604 H Street. On paper, the Surratts were finally doing okay. But underneath the success, everything was rotten. John had become a full-blown alcoholic, which wasn't helped by the fact that he owned a tavern and had constant access to alcohol and people to consume it with. And Mary, she was the one holding the entire household together. She ran the tavern, she handled the post office, she raised the kids, Isaac, Elizabeth Susanna, and John Jr., while also managing the farm and covering up for John's drinking. In one letter to her priest, Mary wrote, "Mr. Surratt has become so that he is drunk on every occasion and are more and more disagreeable every day. I think sometimes I would give the world if you could come in and give him a good lecture for me." That's not just exhausted, that's desperate. And then it gets darker. Another letter from Mary says, "Goodbye. Perhaps these are the last lines you will ever receive from these poor, feeble fingers, as he has said he will take my life if I do not become what he wishes, and that I am determined to never be. That's not just a troubled marriage anymore. That's domestic abuse. And in a time when women had no protection. It seems, too, that the only person Mary had to confide in was the priest, which makes the situation even sadder. Mary stayed religious throughout this, helping found the St. Ignatius Church. There is a Catholic church called St. Ignatius in Oxon Hill that dates back to the 1800s and is still operating, though I couldn't confirm if it's the same one she raised money to start. She even tried to get John to convert to Catholicism, hoping it might help sober him up. It didn't. She wrote, "I am sad, my poor heart are aching, and my eyes are almost blinded with tears of the bitterest kind." It's truly heartbreaking. She was holding the family's world together with one hand and wiping her tears with the other. Now, rumor time. It's said Mary grew very close to her priest, like very close. This same priest that she was writing letters to. So close that the church allegedly sent him away to Boston just to separate them. And after that, like I mentioned, they kept in touch by letter. Make of that what you will, but a little bit of tea for you there. Despite their businesses doing well, the Surratts still couldn't afford proper schooling for their kids. Eventually, Mary saved up enough to send their daughter Anna to boarding school at St. Mary's Female Institute. The boys eventually went to St. Thomas Manor in Chapel Point. But money was always tight, especially with John drinking it away. But things were about to get a lot worse in a lot of different ways. Starting first with a biggie. The Civil War, which began on April 12, 1861. On paper, Maryland was a Union state, but in practice, it was much more complicated. Being a border state, there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers, especially in the South, and Maryland itself allowed slavery, like I mentioned earlier with the Surratts enslaving people in Prince George's County. Her oldest son, Isaac, joined the Confederate Army in Texas. Mary's younger son, John, would use his border state status to his advantage, serving as a spy for the Confederacy. Because being a spy was not a full-time gig, he also took over as postmaster for that post office in Surrattsville. Which is interesting because that's a government job and he worked for the Confederacy as a spy. And doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Mary herself was a Confederate sympathizer who knew exactly what her sons and many of her business's proprietors were up to. And she and her daughter Anna ran the tavern. Between the tavern and post office, a lot of Confederate mail and messages went through Surrattsville. So, a nation at war, and her sons are traitors. Not great. But it gets worse. On August 19th, 1862, John died. The father, John, died. Just suddenly gone. Which you'd think might have solved a few problems, but instead, it dropped everything on Mary's shoulders. The debts, the tavern, the house, the kids, all of it. And then, in 1864, slavery was finally abolished in Maryland, a full year after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, freeing slaves in the South. This objectively good news for humanity, though, meant Mary lost access to the enslaved labor that had helped run the tavern, in addition to losing her husband of 22 years. It was a turning point. Her whole way of life collapsed, which, to be fair, was never going to be sustainable because owning literal human beings is disgusting and not a proper way to situate your life. And I feel zero sadness for her losing this insane privilege. But it still had an impact on her ability to handle the whole load of things that were now on her plate. That's why Mary packed up and moved into the D.C. townhouse on 8th Street that she and John had once rented out. She started taking in boarders to survive, all Catholic like her, probably because it felt safe and familiar. There were quite a few Confederates staying there as well. With the extra income, she was able to afford 2 or 3 servants, just enough to keep the household running. Meanwhile, a man named John Lloyd took over the Surrattsville Tavern for $500 a year and maintained it as a Confederate safe house the same way Mary did. Mary officially moved out on October 1st, 1864. And that is where we're going to pause, because what happens next flips the story from grieving widow trying to survive to maybe criminal mastermind. You see, once Mary's living on 8th Street, her son befriends a young actor. Handsome, charismatic, real dramatic. His name? John Wilkes Booth. And everything spirals from there. It was a crisp day in the fall of 1864 when a handsome young John Wilkes Booth, member of a prominent family and a famous actor himself, met John Surratt Jr. The two became connected because of their shared Confederate sympathies, and Booth wanted to leave a mark on the divided nation and help the bloody war come to an end, with Confederate flags still waving high. The Confederacy was losing. Atlanta had fallen, and in Booth's mind, there was one person to blame for it all. Abraham Lincoln, the traitor who freed the slaves in the South and rejected the ideals of white supremacy. I mean, how dare he, right? Booth and John became fast friends because of their mutual interests in, I guess, watching the world burn. They made an unlikely pair. Though college educated, John was middle class at best and a ne'er-do-well. And Booth was a famous figure who performed in plays at prestigious venues such as Ford's Theater. For you history buffs out there, that's a hint of foreshadowing. John and Booth agreed. The Confederacy must be successful. Slavery must remain intact. Lincoln is the Antichrist. Insert more conspiracies and insane beliefs here. The two stewed in their mutual hatred of the Union as they drank whiskey and played cards, fuming over the success of the North and the progressive policies of the commander-in-chief. They weren't just interested in talk, though. Despite not being on the battlefield, they wanted to help the Confederacy as best they could. And they devised a plan. A devious plan. A plan so ambitious, it would bring an already fractured country to its knees. They were going to kidnap, yes, kidnap, President Abraham Lincoln. John, because of the questionable company he kept and extensive contacts among Confederate sympathizers, knew exactly where to start. Together with Booth, they recruited 6 men to join them in their treasonous plot. The most consequential players were David Harold, described as dull-witted and simple-minded, who studied pharmacy at Georgetown and worked as a pharmacist's assistant. George Surratt, a German-born carriage painter and boatman who brought supplies and spies across the Potomac River for the Confederacy. Lewis Powell, who used the alias Lewis Payne, a tall, broad man who fought for the Confederacy and was wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg. Samuel Arnold, another Confederate veteran and childhood friend of Booth's. Michael O'Laughlin, another childhood friend of Booth's and former Confederate soldier. And, of course, John Surratt Jr., who by now we are all well acquainted with. The men would meet at Mary Surratt's establishments for months to hatch their diabolical plan to kidnap the highest-ranking official in the country, during a time of war, no less. She may not have been actively directing people on where to go, but she fed them, plied them with alcohol, and knew exactly what they were up to. She was at best an enabler, and at worst an active participant. Mary, though religious, was no saint. She was a Catholic second and a Confederate first. Like many a plan, the plotting took months, but the plot itself came together quickly. Kind of like when you decide to go to a bar after you've spent hours with your friends trying to figure out where to go, but then within like a span of 15 minutes, everyone has their shoes on and are already in the Uber. Although, to be historically accurate, I guess we should replace bar with ball and Uber with horse-drawn carriage. A few days before his scheduled visit, the crew learned that President Abraham Lincoln was scheduled to attend a showing of Still Waters Run Deep, a play by Tom Taylor. I don't know if there just wasn't much else to do during wartime in the 1800s, but Lincoln loved himself a good theater moment. If only he lived long enough to see Oh Mary by Cola Scola. Spoiler, that is not the last time Cola Scola comes up in this session. He probably would have loved it. Anyway, back to the plot. Lincoln was not just going to see this production for the fun of it. He was actually attending the play at Campbell Hospital, just outside of Washington, D.C., where it was being put on to boost morale for injured soldiers from the war. I presume these would have been injured Union soldiers. Upon learning where the president would be, the play was taking place on March 17th, and Booth found out about it a few days before. The plan that they'd been workshopping for months was finally put into motion. It was time for them to put their money where their mouth was and kidnap the President of the Union. This was no small task, no simple task, and certainly not one that everyone expected to make it out of alive. They were willing to put their lives on the line to ensure a victory for the Confederacy, even more than many of them already had by actually serving in the war. The plan was as simple as it was grandiose. The men, all on horseback, would surround the president's carriage on the way to the hospital and commandeer it. Once they were in charge of the carriage, armed men would keep the driver and its occupants safe while they made their way to the Potomac. I presume Lewis Powell would be the one inside the carriage holding Lincoln hostage, since Lincoln was a whopping 6'4", and Lewis was recruited due to his height and size that was big enough to subdue the towering commander. Once at the shores of the infamous river, they would use a monkey wrench to remove the wheels off the carriage, making it easier to cross the body of water. This is where George's expertise in shuttling Confederates back and forth across the river would come in handy. From there, they would make their way to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is the goal here? They kidnap the president and then what? Take him to another play? Torture him? Kill him, even? If only it were that simple. Instead, they planned to use Lincoln as a bargaining chip to get the Confederate prisoners in the North freed. A classic prisoner swap. But there's more. They weren't just interested in seeing their buddies again. They knew the power that holding the commander-in-chief hostage had, and they weren't going to use it just to free any random Joe or John or Lee. They were going to negotiate, with whom I don't know, maybe the vice president, an end to the Civil War that favored the South, using Honest Abe as the ultimate bargaining chip. And on March 17, 1865, their plan was put into motion. The men saddled up their horses and spared no expense when it came to arming themselves for the occasion. Packing guns, swords, knives, a rope, and that monkey wrench I mentioned earlier, the group began galloping towards the hospital to intercept Abe and kickstart their grand plan. Only things wouldn't exactly play out that way, because Abe never showed up for the play. Maybe it was a change of plans, which I think is the most likely, or bad intelligence, or even the president's men getting a whiff of what was going to happen to the president and changing course. But something prevented him from making a showing that evening. So, just like that, these, with a massive eye roll and air quotes, strong men, whimpered away, likely returning to the Surrattsville Tavern to drink their sorrows into oblivion and pretend like they would have been successful if only they had a chance to prove it to the world. It's like when someone says they could have gone pro if they didn't get that injury in high school. That's kind of the vibe I feel like they were giving off after this. Booth, in particular, was fuming. He didn't take kindly to failure, and his already boiling hot anger towards Lincoln turned into steam that burst through his ears. He wasn't going to let this get him down, and almost immediately dove back into the planning process to figure out how they would regroup and try again. This time, though, the girlies were fighting a little bit. Michael O'Laughlin and Samuel Arnold, oddly enough both of Booth's longtime friends, thought that Booth's plans were getting increasingly unrealistic and decided to part ways with this motley crew. They were willing to try and kidnap the president once, but twice just felt insane. Gotta draw the line somewhere, right? Because who tries to kidnap the president twice? And you know what? Maybe Booth agreed with them. It would be insane to try and kidnap the president twice. Maybe the reason their plan didn't work in the first place was because they weren't thinking big enough. Maybe God prevented this plan from taking place because it wasn't in the cards for Booth or Lincoln. Maybe Booth was meant for something bigger. Something that would reverberate around the globe and change not just the entire reputation of his well-to-do family, but history itself. Booth was done trying to kidnap Lincoln. That felt like child's play. He was ready to go a step further, or maybe even several steps further. He was going to murder President Abraham Lincoln and bring both Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward down with him. It was time for the Union leaders to meet their maker, and Booth knew just the people who could make it happen, under the watchful eye of our protagonist, Miss Mary Surratt. One day, John Lloyd, the man who leased the tavern from Mary Surratt, was there in Surrattsville, minding his own business. It was just another day, another round of chores, another bottle of whiskey. But then 3 familiar men walked in: John Surratt Jr., David Harold, and George Surratt. Now, like I said, these weren't strangers. Lloyd knew them. They'd all shared whiskey, sat around the tavern table, and played cards together. He probably considered them friends, or at least the kind of people you don't ask too many questions about. But this visit was different. John Surratt called him into the front parlor. On the sofa sat an arrangement that was chilling even by wartime standards. 2 Spencer carbine rifles, boxes of ammunition, a coil of rope, and a monkey wrench. They just loved a good monkey wrench. No one offered an explanation. John just told Lloyd to hide them and told him exactly where to do it. He directed him upstairs to a room that hadn't been plastered yet. The joists were still exposed, which gave just enough room to slide the rifles into a long, narrow pocket between the floor above and the dining room ceiling below. Lloyd did what he was told. He didn't want to. He didn't like it. He was already treading on thin ice as a Confederate sympathizer running a quiet safe house. Hiding weapons was a step further, a step too far. But how do you say no to the landlady's son? Especially when that landlady is Mary Surratt, one of the few people in his life with any real power over him. So he swallowed his conscience, hid the weapons, and went about his business. A few days later, on April 11th, Lloyd was outside in bad weather when he ran into Mary herself. He stopped to greet her, polite as always, but the conversation took a strange turn. Mary asked about the rifles. That alone was odd. She hadn't been there when they were stashed. But she not only knew about them, she knew where they were. Lloyd told her they were still hidden, shoved way back, hard to find. Even the police wouldn't spot them. Mary nodded, thought about it a second, and then dropped a line that would stick in Lloyd's head for the rest of his life. Get them ready. They would be wanted soon. She didn't say who would want them or why. She just left it at that. Then came April 14th. At around 5 p.m., Lloyd arrived at the tavern, already very drunk, when he found Mary there in person. She pulled him aside and said something nearly identical to what she'd said before. Mr. Lloyd, I want you to have those shooting irons ready. There will be parties here tonight who will call for them. And once again, she made it weirder. She handed him a small wrapped package, telling him to give it to the men who would come. After she left, Lloyd peeked inside. He couldn't help himself. He was drunk and feeling snoopy. And inside, he found a pair of elegant, expensive binoculars. He didn't know what to make of this or what was coming, but he knew whatever it was coming tonight. That night, April 14th, 1865, the cast of My American Cousin was buzzing. They were expecting the arrival of President Lincoln, who was hot off the heels of a win in the Civil War and eager to celebrate the nation's newfound peace and unity. If there were any pollsters around at this time, his approval rating, at least among the Union, would have been through the roof. The cast was ready to give the performance of a lifetime. They had even written a song to be sung specifically in the president's honor by everyone in the play. He arrived at Ford's Theater alongside his wife and First Lady, Mary, not to be confused with Cola Scola, ready for a night of culture and relaxation. In classic POTUS tradition, he waltzed into the theater a good 20 minutes late, rousing the crowd who greeted him with thunderous applause as he approached the ornate box specifically designed for his arrival. After the excitement wound down, the play resumed. Everyone's eyes were glued to the stage, except for when they stole a glance at the infamous man sitting in one of the best seats in the house. The Lincolns were having a grand old time, with one theatergoer remarking that Mary kept her hand on Lincoln's leg and would laugh and point at things on the stage that she found funny. It was said that Mary enjoyed watching her husband's enjoyment as much as she did the show itself. Unbeknownst to the audience, another famous figure, who had performed in that same theater, was lurking in the shadows. He had a gun, a plan, and a target, and waited for the perfect moment when the audience was riddled with an infectious laughter to pull the trigger. And that, Crimestituents, is where I'm going to leave you for part 1 of Mary Surratt and what you now know to be the assassination of President Lincoln. I am so sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger, but I promise it's worth it. I'm still not going to say the name of the book I read for this case because it contains a spoiler, but if you really must know, it is linked in the show notes. Part 2 will be out next week, and this could even turn into a 3-parter. We shall see. I will have an update for you next time we talk. And with that, Crimestituents, will you help me gavel us out?